Hello and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is the Ukraine War news update for the 24th of June 2023. And my goodness, what a lot of news, although it is almost all about one subject. This is kind of strangling the information space in terms of trying to find out all my usual bits and pieces concerning the war in Ukraine. So this will mainly focus on what is going on with regard to Yevgeny Prigozhin, the leader of the private military company, the Wagner mercenaries, and the Russian MOD and Putin. And you hopefully will have seen my update from last night, UK time, that gave you some breaking news context as to what's going on. It appears that Prigozhin has gone rogue. Exactly what's happening, I'm not too sure. He was, I think, careful. So some people claiming this is not a coup because he's just trying to oust the military. But I think now it's getting towards being looking a little bit more like a coup due to the response that he has given to Putin's speech. So Putin has come out and given a speech this morning, pre-recorded speech, as Philip O'Brien says. So it looks like Prigozhin is doing this on his own. Wow! Question: how many Russian army troops are actually in Russia and can be used to stop him? What is going on is that Prigozhin has, it could be 25,000 troops at his disposal, and has gone rogue inside Russia. And we'll look at the map in a second. He is, I guess, marching on Moscow, but it's a bit unknown as to how much he has at his disposal to do the job that he wants to do. And the question is, well, what is the job he wants to do? Does he want to march into the Kremlin? Does he want to just get rid of Gerasimov and Shoigu? I don't know. He's even got a cut on his face from what he's been doing. So there could have been some gunfire involving him. But there you go. So, okay, what's Putin said? Putin has come out today and given this speech and said, in a 5-minute address, he presented Russia's ongoing war against Ukraine as Russia's war for survival, and said that any infighting that undermines the unity of Russia at such a time is essentially treachery. So he's calling Prigozhin out here. Putin went on to call the infighting between Prigozhin and Russian MOD a, quote, deadly threat to Russian statehood, adding that, quote, actions to defend against such a threat will be severe. All those who plotted rebellion will face inevitable punishment. The armed forces and other state institutions have received the necessary order, Putin said. So what happened to start this off? Well, it started when he claimed late yesterday that the Russian military had launched a missile strike against his fighters in Ukraine. And there was imagery of a base. There's no real evidence of this. I mean, it showed a base where Wagner were hanging out and claimed that had been attacked, inflicting a high number of casualties. Following the alleged attack, which couldn't be confirmed, as Kyiv Independent says here, he vowed to take revenge and said he was starting a march for justice against the Russian military leadership. This could be a bunch of different disinformation there. Like, that base might not have been attacked because how deep into conspiracy theory does one go? There have been claims that this must have been prepared for a long time. So he pulled his troops out of Bakhmut. He's taken them far into the rear for a bit of R&R, and yet suddenly he's got these troops in Rostov-on-Don area, marching up through Voronezh and towards Moscow. That's not something you do if your base was just attacked yesterday. My guess is that he's been planning this. He's been gradually saying more and more critical things against the Russian MOD. Again, not exactly against Putin, but the implications must surely be clear. And I guess that this has been on the cards for some time. Now it is a good time to look at the map because it gives us a sense of what's going on and how this might seriously affect the war efforts in Ukraine. Okay, he has supposedly taken control of the southern military district headquarters in Rostov-on-Don, effectively taking control of Rostov-on-Don. So this is this city here, quite far to the south of Russia, but it's this oblast that is completely bordering uh, the eastern territories of Ukraine, and that means that this is well, Phillips O'Brien are going to talk about this in a second, but this is hugely important in terms of supplying the Russian troops in Ukraine. Wagner is now sitting on the supply routes into Ukraine for the Russian MOD. Then he's supposed to have sort of been marching up here through Voronezh, bypassing possibly the city itself, but in Voronezh Oblast, and then going on the way to Moscow up there. So you can see that this is you can't very clearly see the borders of the oblast, but it's possibly the best there. That Rostov Oblast is a big one, and then you're going up to Voronezh here. That's the next oblast along to the north, and then Moscow is a couple of oblasts further north from there. Again, what are his intentions? It's difficult to say. Anyway, in response to Putin's speech, Wagner has now said, Papa Putin made the wrong choice, or Pippa, I'm not sure how you pronounce that. That's worse for him. Soon we will have a new president. In other words, there ain't no doubt now as to whether this is approaching a coup. It's looking very much coup-ish to me. Whereas last night it was arguably just it could be seen in terms of infighting in the military. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Wagner PMC recruitment billboards are already being ripped down. The question is, how much support does Prigozhin have in Russia and in certain military areas? So you've had a lot of big names coming out in support of Putin, people who are in charge of districts, annexed areas in Zaporizhia, Crimea, those kind of areas, supporting Putin. You've had other military people coming out to support him. We will come on to Ramzan Kadyrov in a little while, but it is going to be interesting to see how much support Prigozhin has throughout the Russia in terms of the general public. I talked to you the other day about these vox pops that were done on the streets, I think of Moscow, where people were interviewing just passers by saying, what do you think of Prigozhin? And most people didn't know who he was. So we know who he is because he's in the news all the time. Wagner in the news, but actually the Russian state TV hasn't been reporting on Wagner. They say all the successes are the Russian MOD, and that kind of represents this tension. And that means that actually the general public, by and large, don't really know who Prigozhin is. So if he's going to go and do this big coup, he won't have the backing of the people necessarily. He might have the backing of people in the armed services, armed forces, who might be disgruntled with their own chain of command in the MOD, so on and so forth. But I don't think he'll have the popular backing. Now, some people are talking about how this coup, or whatever you want to call it, was chosen. Well, the Friday evening was a well-chosen time to execute this. Russia's security forces are reported to be in disarray following the attempted mutiny by the Wagner Group. It seems that to have been perfectly timed for a moment Friday night when many personnel were too drunk to respond quickly, while others are refusing to fight Wagner. A Russian Telegram channel that Chris Owicki uses quite a lot reports that its sources are saying the situation with various security organizations, the FSB, Ministry of Internal Affairs, saying everyone is up and running, urgently reporting in. Now all the offices are like one big after party. 80% of the staff smell of booze. Some of them can barely stand on their feet, can't arm them, can't send them anywhere. Friday night's a perfect time to start something like this. Everybody's standing around waiting for something, no introductions. A couple of hours more and the conflicts among themselves will start when the alcohol starts to wear off. Unwillingness to fight Wagner appears to be a common theme. Quote, there is a real panic in Rostov, especially among the police. There is more than a 40% shortfall in personnel among those called up in connection with Operation Fortress, which is the operation to defend in these emergency situations places of importance, security installations and so on. So they're only getting 40% personnel called up in Rostov to support the Russian. That would be in defense of the Russian intentions and the government, as opposed to Wagner. Wagner forces were able to cross the border from Ukraine without opposition, despite orders not to let them through. Quote, both the border service of the FSB and the Interior Ministry received instructions to stop Wagner PMC. No one is complying, as it is not realistic. Most ominously for the Kremlin, elements of the security forces appear to be actively siding with Wagner or refusing to act against it. The Defense Ministry has lost control over a number of units and formations of the Southeastern Military District. It will not be possible to organize defense by the Rosgvardia, the Russian National Guard, and the FSB. Local leaders are extremely careful in their statements. Attempts to counter Prigozhin are only going through the FSB and the National Guard. The Ministry of Defense has simply withdrawn. Junior officers either refuse to follow orders or directly support Wagner. End quote. And Shoigu and the MOD leadership team just hid and completely lost touch with reality. The fear is obviously serious. Sorry, that's the end of the quote. Wagner is reported to be directly taking control of some Eastern military district units. Quote, a number of units of the MOD that participated in the war are beginning to come under the command of Wagner. Entire corps, Shoigu and Gerasimov's people are being removed. End quote. General Gerasimov himself has not been seen in public since the mutiny began. According to Wagner channels, he was in Rostov when it fell to Wagner forces. He is said to have, quote, escaped from the Rostov military headquarters along with people loyal to him and is holed up in a civilian apartment with his friends in Rostov. Wow, of course, that's completely unconfirmed. And this is what Rostov looks like at the moment. You have tanks in the streets. You have really now loud noise in my ears. You have tanks on the streets. You have shooters lying around in different positions. It is basically looking rather like a coup, whilst at the same time, there's quite a lot of bemused general public just walking around filming everything on their smartphones. So these barrels are not, this is nothing to do with the general public, right? This is not any kind of revolution that's involving civilians. These are pointing at military headquarters, like Southern Military District headquarters, I think. These barrels, this is all about internal military machinations. Meanwhile, there are columns, I mean, all sorts going on, right? So there are people being seen in Voronezh. There's some military, Wagner military appearing in Voronezh. But this is odd because they should really have one objective, or at least a clarity of objective. This looks like a bunch of troops just hanging around the underpass. Just there to be seen, I guess. Is that their intention? I don't know. Time is of the essence, I would think, in this situation for Wagner. They are, reportedly around Rostov. Aviation is about. I'll come on to that in a second. And then they have columns of vehicles supposedly driving north. Wagner certainly didn't go unprepared. They took their air defense systems with them. Here's a Panzer S1 air defense system seen within one of the columns near Voronezh. Another column of Wagner PMC spotted near Buturinovka, southeast of Voronezh. Reportedly, they are heading for the airport, which is situated on the southwestern outskirts of the city. Of course, if you're serious about doing all this stuff, which of course they are, in for a penny, in for a pound, right? You've got to go big or go home. You can't like do a half coup because it's never going to work. So it's got to be everything. So it's going to be looking at military installations, like airports as well, civilian as well in that case, but really important logistic hubs and also military installations. It's going to be fascinating to see, what the Russian military are able to do to stop Wagner, because of course they've committed so much of their military to Ukraine. It's all tied up in Ukraine. What they do have a lot of are internal security forces, but as we've seen, are they prepared to support Wagner or the Kremlin? Which way are they going to go? Are they just going to not want to get involved and kind of passively stand by? Grey Zone claims 180 Russian soldiers and other personnel surrendered to Wagner forces at the Bugayevka border crossing in Voronezh Oblast and agreed not to interfere with the actions of Russian volunteers from the Wagner group and laid down their arms. So that is at least one instance where the Russian military aren't standing in the way of Wagner, where they are inside Russia. And of course, they just don't have a huge amount of military, I would suggest, inside Russia. This video reportedly shows the Wagner Group's convoy moving across Russia's Voronezh Oblast in the direction of Moscow, although it can't be verified. It appears likely. You're going to have a lot of technicals, trucks, but also kind of civilian-looking vehicles in with that as well, as they're probably grabbing everything they can. Verstka has reported that a column of Wagnerites is moving to Moscow, bypassing Voronezh. They did not enter the city. So just to remind you, this is Voronezh Oblast. So coming up from Rostov, coming up here through Voronezh, or past Voronezh, through Voronezh Oblast, past the city, and then on the way to Moscow. I mean, what's going to happen when they reach Moscow? What are they going to be met with? Are the Russian military going to remain loyal to Gerasimov and Shoigu? All these questions, of course. Russian Telegram channels reporting that Wagner PMCs have entered Voronezh and are on the outskirts of Krasnodar and Volgograd as well. So no one is resisting the militants. Krasnodar, for example, is this region there. So when you're looking at the war efforts for Russians, because remember, Russians are in the middle of being at war with Ukraine here. This is massively distracting. Imagine what the troops along the front line are going to be thinking. What they are already there with very low morale. Suddenly, they're wondering whether their superiors are going to be remain loyal to the Kremlin. What do they, as soldiers, feel? All of these thoughts are going to be going through their heads while they're hearing all this news about what is taking place. And meanwhile, every oblast bordering Ukraine, the annexed regions or the controlled regions, occupied regions of Ukraine, all of these border regions are now under the control of Wagner, arguably. And what does that say about the continued military project there? So, yes, as I've said, footage of Wagner troops in various places. You can see here that Wagner PMC is headed by Prigozhin is claimed to have taken control of the military facilities, including airfields in two large Russian cities, Voronezh and Rostov-on-Don. So various claims. One claim that they're bypassing the city, others claiming they control it or control at least military installations there. They could well have gone through Ukraine then to get to Voronezh rather than going all the way through Rostov. I don't know. And then there are also, so Chris Owicki here referring to Alexander Clarkson, who said that the Ukrainians kind of have known something would be up. For the past 3 months, Ukrainian intelligence officials were very confident that all hell was about to break loose in Russia in ways that were dismissed by Western counterparts. Chris Owicki says, who could have imagined that Ukrainians would know Russia better than the West? And then this bit of footage I find quite interesting. So this is a local man in Rostov. This is an area where Wagner seem to be the most, I guess, successful, or there are a lot of Wagner in Rostov-on-Don, the city. But here you've got a chap saying, "You're being rude. I'm asking you questions, but have some shame. Are you the protectors of the fatherland or not?" He says. Why are you starting this mess here? Who are you? Who is senior? I'm not being rude. I'm just asking questions. It's you starting the panic. This goes back to the idea of what do the general people on the street believe? What do they feel? This guy's like, what's going on? Like, he would have been fed Russian state media narratives, and he's questioning like these guys are and why they're doing this, and shame on them because this is not obviously in the best interests of Russia. So it might not be hugely easy considering what the Russian public do or don't know. However, they are quite compliant, the Russian public, given that they've been politically inactive now for like ever. A brief fling in the 90s with democracy, but other than that, they have been, very good at just doing what they've been told to do, under fear of retribution. Then we come on to Ramzan Kadyrov. So Kadyrov, this represents where he's been with regard to Prigozhin over the last few months, which is they've had a bit of a tussle themselves. So he's not the best friend of uh, Prigozhin. He's come out now publicly to support Putin. He says the rebellion must be crushed, and his lads are on their way to do so. So that's not good for Prigozhin. How useful Kadyrov's and his Chechens will be? Will they be just kind of like TikTok fighters? They're already on their way to the tension zone, says Kadyrov, and he called the action of Wagner PMC a military rebellion and promised that it will be suppressed. If tough measures have to be taken to do this, we are ready. So that is another angle to this that sits in favor of the Kremlin as opposed to Prigozhin. So that's kind of what's going on. Sorry if I'm not being hugely coherent, because there's so much information flying about that it's really difficult to order it coherently and to get my sense of what's going on to then reflect that to you guys or communicate that to you guys, because I'm not wholly sure. If we go to the Ukrainian general staff figures, I mean, this seems almost like irrelevant in some ways, doesn't it? If we go to the Ukrainian general staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before, 580 liquidated personnel, 7 tanks, 6 APVs, 30 artillery systems, 2 MLRS, 4 anti-aircraft warfare systems, 1 helicopter, 13 drones, 14 cruise missiles, 23 vehicles and fuel tanks, 3 pieces of special equipment. What can we say about that? Pretty difficult for the Russians, although tanks, APVs are dropping down a little bit. Tanks 7, that's a fair number there. Troops are a little bit lower than the day before, but 30 artillery systems is just phenomenal. 2 MLRS, 1 helicopter, and also 23 vehicles and fuel tanks. So the logistics being continued to be hit. 3 pieces of special equipment, and I think this is significant for anti-aircraft warfare systems. So they're still hitting those key categories really significantly. And at some point, Russia will surely be weak enough that the Ukrainians can exploit their defensive lines. At the same time, last night, and I don't know whether this would have been already planned or this was a distraction because they knew something was happening with Wagner, but they released something like 51, I think, cruise missiles, the Russians, and of which 41 were shot down, and a couple of drones as well. That means 10 cruise missiles did get through, which is quite a large amount. Don't have any details about what was hit. I have a feeling that all the ones around Kyiv were shot down, although debris did fall from the sky, and I think it killed some people there in Kyiv, but that was from stuff that was shot down. What else can I say in this hits and losses section? Russian forces destroyed a French supplied Caesar self-propelled howitzer belonging to the Ukrainian army. So this is a high-value target that's hit in the Zaporizhia region with a Lancet kamikaze drone. The driver managed to get rid of the first Lancet kamikaze, but during the escape, the vehicle overturned and the Russian forces targeted the self-propelled howitzer for the second time. As a result of targeting the Caesar howitzer, it was destroyed. So it there you go. You can see it skidding off the road, traveling at a high speed. I mean, this is shoot and scoot. So this tells you quite a lot, I think. That high speed is a really good way of getting away from the position you were in to get to your next position, to avoid counter battery fire, but also to avoid Lancet drones. Lancet drones aren't the quickest, right? And if you are traveling at a rate of knots, that helps to evade a Lancet. And had he not skidded here, he could have evaded that Lancet. Well, he did evade it, but then he could have lived to fight another day. But unfortunately, that Caesar is not in a good way. So on and so forth. And then it then it gets hit later. So yeah, that's a big loss for the Ukrainians. Now back to Wagner. Wagner have shot down two Mi-8 MTPREW helicopters. So these are rarer helicopters that are used in electronic warfare. These are really high value targets, and Wagner's just shot down two of them, and a Mi-35 attack helicopter. That is pretty good for the Ukrainians, right? There is evidence of at least one of those claimed that in the Voronezh region of Russia, under mysterious circumstances, a Russian Mi-8 was shot down, allegedly by Wagner. A Russian source associated with military aviation claims that it was the electronic warfare system helicopter, and that two of these have been shot down, and also that Mi-35. So these are Russian sources saying this. At the same time, this whole situation, along with the Wagner rebellion, looks very obscure. Therefore, try to take all the information that you now see on Twitter about Wagner specifically with caution and a touch of skepticism. There is also now a report coming through on Russian channels reporting that Wagner shot down a Russian Defense Ministry plane in Voronezh as well, with some imagery to go alongside with that. That is just really significant. 4 pieces of 4 airframes being taken out is massive. And I was wondering whether these would be added to the Ukrainian General Staff figures. We've seen previously where there have been losses. Well, I think it was 5 or 6 airframes that were lost in Russia in that very significant purple patch about a month or so ago, possibly taken out by air defense systems from within Ukraine. There are different claims still about that, or by their own air defense systems. Those weren't added to these numbers, so I don't know whether these ones will be either. So, right, moving on to other bits and pieces. General Ben Hodges has said that Ukraine could free Crimea by the end of the summer, says the ex-US general. They could march in. I mean, I could go into the details here. It's just interesting that people are still or people are confident enough about where the Ukrainians are at now that they can foresee a point where they could march into Crimea by the end of summer. And yesterday, at the same time, I would have been rather more skeptical than I am today. Now, this is where I'm going to give you some analysis of this whole Wagner thing that's happening. I think this is the beginning of the end for the Russians in the war against Ukraine. I don't think they can come back from this. And I think that's obviously hugely significant. Why do I think that? Well, what is the best case scenario for Russia? The best case scenario for the Kremlin, for Putin, for Russia right now is that this uprising is quashed, right? And either the troops give up or they are defeated, or something happens whereby the Kremlin prevail. You would then not have Prigozhin involved in the war in Ukraine, and he was one of the most successful assets that the Russians had. You would arguably not have a number of those troops, as they would either be liquidated or locked up. You would then have a really uneasy tension. You will have Gerasimov and Shoigu still in place, with the rest of the army going, well, there's just been a mutiny against these guys. We think they're pretty much douchebags or whatever. So therefore, you've still got the existing tensions within the military hierarchy that would need to be dealt with, and so on and so forth. It's just even the best case scenario for Russia doesn't look good here. And when you are teetering on the edge of having a counteroffensive, strike into your military heartlands and potentially be successful, you need to be as with it and cohesive as possible. And that is definitely not happening. I mean, Ukraine could be really opportunistic here. This is potentially really good news for Ukraine. Now, on the other hand, if Wagner win here, and if Prigozhin has some successful coup where he either ousts Gerasimov and Shoigu or Putin, I don't think there's a situation where Putin can allow Prigozhin to remain. I don't think those two are going to be in power together. So if, on the other hand, if um, Prigozhin is entirely successful, then that's going to cause absolute pandemonium throughout the Russian political world, and therefore throughout the military sphere as well, and across the territories in Ukraine. It's I. It may down the line be quite bad for Ukraine by point of fact that you would have a real psychotic ultra nationalists in charge in some capacity in Moscow, whether of the military or replacing Putin, and that might not be a good move in the long term. But I think in the short term, with regard to what's going on operationally, neither option, neither side of the spectrum is good for the Russian military operation in Ukraine. So I think that this is the beginning of the end. I don't think you can come back easily from this. And yeah, I honestly think this could be the seismic activity that produces really significant cracks in the Russian military edifice in this project of trying to well, again, trying to fill in the gap there. We don't know what their objectives are still. What are the Russians trying to achieve? Because we know that they can't take Kiev. We know that they can't replace the Zelensky government. So yeah, whatever their objectives are, this is not helping them. And yeah, I'll be interested to see what you guys think about that. Right, just another slightly well, this is completely disconnected from what we're talking about, but still on the kind of news. Pro-Russian Telegram channels noticed Putin appeared at different events at the same time, suggesting there are several Putins. I saw some old footage of Prigozhin being like the chef, that's his name, around Putin and serving him some food from, I don't know, 2010 or something. And Putin really did look very different, suggesting there are several Putins. Moreover, that this was shown by official Kremlin media. Text is taken from the Telegram channel of Victor Alknis. Translation: I've always been skeptical to talk about Putin's doubles, but today I found official information confirming that it's quite possible. According to Russian media, today Putin held a meeting of the Russian Security Council with the participation of the permanent members of the Security Council. The meeting was held via video conference. Since one of the main questions at the Security Council meeting was the situation at the front, I decided to read its transcript and went to the official site of the President of Russia. And I was amazed to find out that the meeting of the Council of the Security Council, including the one devoted to the situation on the front, according to the section events of the official site of the president, began on June the 22nd at 11:55 Moscow time. At 12:15, by 12:15, i.e. 20 minutes later, the president took part in a wreath-laying ceremony at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Alexander Garden in honor of the Day of Remembrance and Mourning. These 20 minutes would only be enough time to travel from the residence in the Kremlin to the Alexander Garden. One might have assumed that the council meeting would have continued after the laying down of flowers, but already at 1:05 p.m. Putin visited the Victory Museum, and at 2:50 he had a meeting with the Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Qatar, Mohammed Al Thani. The most interesting thing is that at 12:03 p.m. the RIA Novosti news agency began a live feed of the meeting of the Council of the Security Council. TASS reported, quote, Putin discusses the situation in the CFV zone with the Sovjet at 12 o'clock. In other words, Putin was in two places at once, in a meeting of the Security Council and laying flowers at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, and then visiting the Victory Museum. I wonder who Putin was at the Security Council, a real Putin or his double, and which Putin is acting as the commander-in-chief and in charge of Ukraine, or maybe there are several doppelgangers, and each of them is designed for certain activities and actions. I'm well aware of the complexities of trying to use lookalikes, and so I hope that there really are none after all, and the explanation is very simple. There was no Security Council meeting today, but then the question arises, why was it necessary to fool the population about its holding? For what purposes was it done? I think that's absolutely fascinating there. And there you go. Another bit of news is that the Russians have already built a pontoon bridge underneath the bridge that was hit by Storm Shadow in the Chonhar Isthmus, or it's that Chonha area crossing the Sivash in the north of Crimea. That was a really significant blow to Russian logistics, but they already have a pontoon bridge built. Of course, what kind of traffic can that pontoon bridge take compared to the bridge that it is replacing? And then just a few bits on military aid. UK Defence Ministry has announced that Russia is using dolphins to secure Sevastopol Navy base. Since summer 2022, Russia has been enhancing the security of the base, according to the UK report, which is here. It says, since summer 2022, the Russian Navy has invested in major enhancements to the security of the Black Sea Fleet's main base at Sevastopol. This includes at least 4 layers of nets and booms across the harbour entrance. In recent weeks, these defences have been highly likely to be augmented by an increased number of trained marine mammals. Imagery shows a near doubling of floating mammal pens in the harbour, which highly likely contain bottlenose dolphins. In Arctic waters, the Navy uses beluga whales and seals. Russia has trained animals for a range of missions, but the ones housed at Sevastopol harbour are highly likely intended to counter enemy divers. And then, there's some imagery to go alongside with that. Various articles on this. Here's one in CBS News. UK says Russia likely training dolphins to in Ukraine's occupied Crimean Peninsula to counter enemy divers. Goes into a bit more detail there and speculation and whatnot. And then, finally, in addition, an additional 20 Marder infantry fighting vehicles will be sent to Ukraine. Rheinmetall will deliver 20 more Marders to Ukraine this summer. It can make a further 60 available. Work on this is already underway at Rheinmetall's plants in Kassel and in Toulouse. Up to 10 IFVs can be delivered per month. And GLSDB, so small diameter bombs, won't be in Ukraine before the autumn. That's something I've talked about previously. They had to build production facilities for those after they got the go-ahead. Anyway, that's today's news. It's mainly about Prigozhin. There's going to be a lot of stuff developing over the day. I don't really know what's going on the front line at the moment because, as I say, the information space has been kind of strangled by this news of Prigozhin and Putin. I will try and get you a frontline update next, and sift through the masses of data that's just exploding all over the socials at the moment. Take care. Thanks for your support. Speak to you soon.